right, well, let's begin. Thank you for having me, and hello to everyone there. Our topic today is excavating the evidence for Jesus, or looking at Jesus in the archaeological and historical record. Now, Jesus is obviously the most important and central character of the entire Bible. And we can see that not only theologically, but just when we look textually, the Gospels comprise nearly half of the New Testament in terms of words. And so obviously, Jesus, the story of Jesus, is of primary importance. And yet today, we often hear about or read people claiming that the Gospels are mythical, or even that Jesus himself may not have been a historical figure. So we're going to go through the Gospels chronologically and look at the archaeological evidence that connects to different periods of the life of Jesus, and see what archaeology has to say about Jesus, and see what some of the other ancient historians say about Jesus, because we do in fact have an incredible amount of evidence that demonstrates Jesus was an historical person, and that the Gospels are reliable throughout the Gospels, throughout all four of them, and the different periods of Jesus's life. Well, first of all, we want to say something about the primary sources for Jesus, which are the four canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And thanks to the preservation of manuscripts in many monasteries and ancient libraries, and some excavations, also, we have these very, very ancient manuscripts now, things that we didn't know about 2 centuries ago. And so we have manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John from 200 AD or before that. And we can see that the copying tradition was excellent for the Bible and the New Testament, and the Gospels in particular here. And when we then encounter arguments such as, maybe Jesus existed, but we can't really trust what's written in the Bible today because it was changed, modified over time, we can now demonstrate through these ancient texts and through looking over the centuries of transmission of the text that the copying tradition was amazing. It was so precise. And we're able to identify where the textual variants are and figure out what the original was. So we do have very good manuscripts. We can trust the gospel manuscripts that we have today in our translation also. And then because of that, we can evaluate the historical claims within those gospel texts. Now, 2 passages from the Gospels are also very important in our discussion today. One comes from Luke at the beginning of his gospel, and he frames his methodology as a historian. So it's very important for us to understand his approach. And he says, since many have undertaken to compile an account concerning the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning passed on to us, it seemed fitting to me also, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write down an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth. So Luke tells us that he has compiled this account. He used eyewitness testimony, people who were actually there and saw the things, and multiple witnesses. And he says he investigated carefully from the beginning. So he didn't just take one person's word for it or one source and not think about it at all. He investigated it, multiple sources, and then he says he wanted to write down it in orderly sequence for you. So it's in chronological order. It's not a mess. It's not all over the place. And he says the objective is so that you may know the exact truth. So these are the claims of Luke. His methods as a historian are very good, and he is giving us a window into how he went about approaching writing the Gospels. And then we can evaluate, is this what he did? Where we can test a historical event, a chronological event. Is this correct? Are his claims correct? We'll see that they are, yes, and that gives us support in being able to say the places where we don't have evidence yet, they should be true based on everything else we've seen. Now, John also has a statement near the end of his gospel, 21:24. He says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." So John is basically signing this statement that says, I was there, I wrote this down, it's true. All right, so he's got a different method than Luke, but it's similar. He was an eyewitness testifying to it. Luke saying he investigated everything. Well, our setting for the Gospels is, of course, the end of the 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD in the Roman Empire. So on this map, you can see the extent of the Roman Empire at the time of Augustus, who was emperor at the beginning of Jesus's earthly life. And you can also see Judea way over in the far east. So Judea was a client kingdom at the time of the birth of Jesus. What this means is that they had a local ruler, and we know that that was Herod the Great, whereas the Roman provinces were either administered by the Senate or by the emperor. So Judea, in terms of importance in the Roman Empire, was very, very low at this time. And that's something I find fascinating about the whole story of Jesus and Christianity, is that in a general historical context, Jesus was totally unimportant. He was a common laborer in the far east of the empire, in a province that was not known for anything other than causing trouble and having strange ideas. And yet his story and his followers spread so rapidly throughout the entire Roman Empire and ended up changing the world. Now, the local context for the life of Jesus and the birth of Jesus is in Judea. King Herod the Great, he was the local ruler. And we know that he had a reign of about 37 years, beginning when the Senate actually recognized him as king of Judea. But then he had to actually go back and take over Jerusalem. So that starts in 37, the takeover of Jerusalem. And then he died in 4 BC. So he's mentioned in Matthew, whereas Luke mentions Augustus. So they're writing to different audiences. Luke is writing to, we might call it an educated Roman or Hellenistic audience. Matthew is writing to a Hebrew audience, so he emphasizes this Judean leader. We know a great deal about Herod the Great. Josephus wrote essentially a biography on his life that he adapted from another scholar whose work is mostly lost. And we have coins, we have buildings, so a great deal is known about Herod the Great. This map shows you his kingdom at the time of Jesus, and then the different color codings there, you can see what happened after Herod's death. It was split into this 4-part kingdom, essentially, between 3 of his sons and his sister, but mainly 3 of his sons. They got the bulk of it. So you can see up there in Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his life, was administered by Herod Antipas, whereas Judea was originally administered by Herod Archelaus. Well, many scholars criticize the birth account of Jesus and say that Matthew and Luke conflict, and they are usually criticize Luke the most. They say that Quirinius doesn't make sense chronologically in this context, and therefore Luke made a huge mistake. It doesn't mesh with Herod the Great. And they say that because they're taking a passage in Josephus where he mentions Quirinius in a tax assessment of Judea after Herod Archelaus has been deposed in 6 AD, and they are projecting that onto Luke's situation. But Luke is talking about something completely different. So he says that it's a census of the whole empire, the entire Roman world that was ordered. And we have that mentioned in the records of Augustus himself in 28 BC, 8 BC, and 14 AD. So it should be talking about, Luke should be talking about one of those 3 empire-wide censuses. Well, the 8 BC census is the only one close to the death of Herod. And so that's the one that we need to hone in on a little bit. And that is the one in which Quirinius was the most active, and active as a military commander, a legate in that region of the Middle East, Syria in particular, as well as nearby provinces. So Luke calls Quirinius a ruler of Syria, who is the one that administered the census in the Judea area. But what do we know about Quirinius and the census? Well, one very interesting artifact turned up in Beirut, and it's a Latin inscription. It's actually a burial epitaph of one of the officers under the command of Quirinius. And it calls Quirinius the legate, so that he's like the general, essentially. This is the highest military rank. And he talks about a census that was being done in Syria province during the time of Augustus. Now, the Romans used the military to do censuses. So that's why Quirinius, as a military legate, was involved in this. That's why one of his officers was. It wasn't the civil government that was doing so. And I think that's why Luke mentions Quirinius rather than the civil governor of Syria province, who at the time we think was a man named Saturninus. We could go into some other details about that, but essentially Luke is getting it right that the military administers it. He's getting it right that Syria province would have been the one connected to that. That was essentially the Roman base of operations for Judea as a client kingdom, and that Quirinius was in the area during that time. Now, to the birth of Jesus in other sources, we had mentioned earlier that some people claim there's no historical evidence for Jesus. Jesus wasn't a historical character. And they often claim that there's no writing outside of the New Testament from ancient times that mentions Jesus. But this is completely false. We'll go through a few different texts, but here's one that talks about the birth of Jesus. And this comes from a skeptic named Celsus in the 2nd century AD. So he was a Roman who was very opposed to Christianity. He was a polytheist. And Origen thankfully preserved some writings of Celsus for us. And he talks about Jesus, and Celsus claims that Jesus invented his birth from a virgin. He says he was born in a certain Judean village of a poor woman of the country who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery. And that after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus. So what does Celsus know about Jesus? He knows that Jesus's father, Joseph, was a carpenter. He knows that he was born in a village of Judea. Okay, that's important for a few reasons, actually. One being that some scholars have claimed that Jesus was actually born in Nazareth, and that's why they call him Jesus of Nazareth, and that he wasn't born in Bethlehem, and that's only included in the nativity story because they're trying to connect it to Old Testament prophecy. But Celsus even knows that Jesus was born in a village of Judea, which Bethlehem is, whereas Nazareth was a village of Galilee. Celsus also knows about the virgin birth claim, And his explanation is that it was adultery. But of course, we read the story in Luke, and we understand how people could get that impression, because even Joseph was originally would have had those kinds of ideas until he was given this revelation by the angel. Well, Jesus grows up in Nazareth, and we do, in fact, have a lot of archaeological evidence now of Nazareth being occupied by Mosaic law observant Jews in the first century. But as his ministry begins, he relocates to Capernaum, and this becomes his base of operations. And there are some important structures at Capernaum that we can look at. The first being the synagogue where Jesus taught. And we have this synagogue mentioned in the Gospels. And then we have a very interesting geographical context in Mark. He says they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and began to teach. And then we have in the following verse, in the passage following, we're going to see that he immediately went from the synagogue to the house of Peter. We'll look at that. But here on the left, you have the synagogue as you would see it if you went there today. And this is not the first century synagogue. This synagogue was constructed beginning in the 4th century, but it was built directly over the 1st century synagogue. So in the photo on the right, you can see that layer of black stones underneath the white stones of the newer synagogue. And this was the older synagogue from the 1st century, made out of local black basalt. And because of pottery fragments and coins that were discovered in the excavation, we know that that was constructed in the early 1st century AD. So it was there when Jesus went to Capernaum and began his ministry, but it also was a fairly new synagogue itself. It hadn't been there for a century or centuries, but it indeed was there. Then we have the next building in Capernaum of importance, and that's Mark 1:29. So just down that passage a few verses, it says, immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew. Now, Simon and Andrew had originally been from the town of Bethsaida, which was on the other side of the lake, but they had moved. Apparently, Peter married someone in Capernaum, and he lived with his in-laws. We see Peter's mother-in-law mentioned in her house. Well, if you walk from the synagogue to this house of Peter, you understand why Mark is saying immediately after, because it will only take you about 10 seconds to walk from the synagogue to the house of Peter, and it's right along the main road there, the ancient main road. Well, this house is very interesting, and some may ask us, well, how can we think this is actually the house of Peter? Is this just maybe some later tradition? We can say a few things about this house that make a strong case for it actually being the house of Peter. So first of all, it was constructed about the 1st century BC, and you can see in the map on the right, this is an overhead archaeological drawing, the red walls, those are the first century BC, first century AD walls. So there was originally this house that was built in a square and rectangular shape, like all the buildings were at that time. But then something changes. So in the second half of the first century, this building gets modified, and it's not used as a house anymore. So the pottery starts to change, basically just oil lamps rather than cooking pots and other household wares. And then in the second century AD, the walls have been plastered, and people have started to write graffiti on them. And there's all sorts of graffiti that was discovered there when it was excavated. And most of them are talking about Jesus, so Lord Jesus Christ, and praising him and things like that. But there are a couple of inscriptions that mention Peter on there too. So here we already have that association with Peter and Peter's house in the second century in inscriptions found there. We have very early traditions. For example, Agaria, when she went to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage, she was told by the local Christians, that this was also the house of Peter, and they had actually turned it into a church. So it seems to have been turned into a house church in the second half of the first century, and then they expanded it over time. So what you see today with this octagonal structure, that was actually constructed in the 5th century as a Byzantine official church, after it had been functioning as a church for centuries. Well, Jesus, of course, did much teaching and was known as a teacher throughout Israel and then beyond later. Also as a wise man, though. And now we again come back to the idea of, what do other ancient sources say about Jesus from the 1st century and the 2nd century? Is there anything about him? And yes, so first we saw talking about the birth and the virgin birth, and his father was a carpenter idea, born in a village of Judea. Now we see a couple of other sources that talk about Jesus as a teacher, and people who had disciples and people who continued to follow his teaching after his crucifixion. So Josephus says at this time there was a wise man called Jesus. So he calls him wise. His conduct was good. He was known to be virtuous, right? All that is consistent, of course, with the Gospels. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. So there we have some corroboration of what we read in the Gospels. Serapion, who was a Syrian philosopher, he was not a Christian, and he was a polytheist, but he wrote a letter to his son in 73 AD, and one of the people he talked about in there was Jesus, and he calls him the wise king, and he says he lived on in the teaching which he had given. So people know about Jesus and his teaching even in the 1st century people who were not Christians. The other major aspect of Jesus's ministry was his miracles. And we'll look at a couple of locations of miracles and then also see what some of the other ancient sources said about that. But we have the pool of Bethesda as one case, and that is in John chapter 5. And John gives a pretty detailed description about this pool. He says it's in Jerusalem. He says that it's associated with sheep. A lot of translations say it's near the sheep gate, but it doesn't actually say gate. So there was a sheep pool there. And he gives a name, Bethesda, and he says it has 5 porticos or 5 stoas. Well, we have numerous ancient texts that talk about the area of Bethesda and this pool that was there. So the Copper Scroll, for example, mentions the area of Bethesda and a pool. And then we excavated it, or earlier archaeologists excavated it, and they found some more details about this. They found that it had been used earlier on in the Hasmonean period as a place to wash the sacrificial sheep. So that's probably how it got this association with the sheep name. And that the 5 porticos that John talks about is not because it was some 5-sided sort of strange shape, but it was 4 sides with the 5th stoa or portico running through the middle. You can see in the reconstruction on the left. The stairs have been discovered. So on the right, you can actually see the steps leading down into the pool that are talked about in that narrative. And then this was covered over. It was part of the destruction of Jerusalem, and so it was lost for over 1,000 years. No one knew exactly where it was or what it looked like, and so that's something that tells us John was actually there and he saw this place. Now, as to the event, there's a very interesting thing that happens after the time of Jesus. When Hadrian goes to Jerusalem and he starts building various things over the sites associated with Jesus, one of the places he does this is at the pool of Bethesda. And he builds a shrine to Asclepius, who was the Greek and Roman god of healing. And so it seems like he wanted people to associate the healing miracle at Bethesda with a Roman deity rather than with Jesus. And this is his pattern. I mean, he did this also at the pool of Siloam. He did this at the birthplace of Jesus, where the Church of Nativity is now. He did this at the crucifixion and tomb site of Jesus, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now. So he had a very intentional method of trying to cover sites associated with Jesus with Roman temples and trying to connect things to Roman deities and cover everything, make people forget about Jesus. The Pool of Siloam is the second miracle site that we'll look at, and this is a very similar structure to the Pool of Bethesda. Just has a different level of preservation. This was discovered very recently, 2004, by accident actually. But you can see the steps going in there, just like described in John. It was a ritual purification pool. This one, of course, is the one that was associated with the healing of the blind man. And again, it was covered over in 70 AD at the destruction of Jerusalem. We know this one was used in the 1st century because of the coins involved. So this is the pool of Siloam of Jesus, so to speak. But no one knew exactly where it was or exactly what it looked like until just recent years. Jesus also in the miracle realm, something he does is a miraculous prophecy, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans, and that's something that we see very clearly in the archaeological and historical record. Well, on the left there, you see the Romans commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem, and they're carrying off the menorah from the temple that's been destroyed. And on the right, you see some of these massive fallen stones. So those were actually pushed off of the Temple Mount after the buildings were destroyed. So the Romans cleared that entire mount structure that Herod had built, the temple and all the associated buildings up there. And so when Jesus comes and says there won't be one stone left upon another, that's absolutely true for all of those buildings on top of the Temple Mount. Now, some people misunderstand the platform itself as a building. It's not a building. It's just a retaining wall that's built around the mountain, and then a flat surface so that they could build on top of it. Josephus, of course, also talks about the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So that, of course, would be something miraculous, as well as raising Lazarus. Now, we can't prove something like that archaeologically, but we can at least show where the tomb of Lazarus probably was located. So this is a first century tomb that is of the type that Lazarus was buried in. It's located in Bethany, has a very ancient tradition associated with it. So it's a plausible location, at least, and gives you an idea of what some of these tombs looked like during that period. Now, what about, though, people's opinions of the miracles of Jesus in the ancient world? Well, I've put 4 different sources here, and I'll mention 2 others actually. But it gives us a perspective. Now, what we notice from all of these is that no one denies that he performed miracles. They actually affirm that, but there are different viewpoints and different explanations for that. And it fits with their worldview. So if we look at Celsus again, so opposed to Christianity, a polytheist, here's his explanation. That when Jesus went to Egypt as a child, which he knows about that too, he says he acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. So he says Jesus performed miracles, but he got them in Egypt through magic, essentially. And then he also says that Jesus proclaimed himself God. Well, I find that also very interesting and important, because another thing that swirls around in academia or general talk is that Jesus never claimed that he was God. And of course, we can go to the Gospels and find instances of that, but we can even see in this non-Christian source from the 2nd century, they know that Jesus proclaimed himself as God. The second source is from Justin Martyr. So he was a Roman polytheist who converted to Christianity, and he became one of the first apologists. And he wrote this letter to the emperor Antoninus, and he tells the emperor that he should appeal to the Roman records themselves. So he says that Jesus performed these miracles, you may easily be satisfied from the acts of Pontius Pilate. Now we know that the acts of Pontius Pilate existed. These would have been his records while he was the governor of Judea. And we have some pseudepigraphal writings of them, but we don't at this time have the actual acts of Pontius Pilate preserved. Maybe they'll be discovered in the future. But he's telling the emperor, you can look at your own Roman records and confirm this. So apparently they were recorded there. Then we have a Jewish source, the Mishnah. And the Mishnah talks about Jesus practicing sorcery or magic and leading Israel into blasphemy. And for that, they were trying to arrest him and capture him and stone him. And we have multiple areas in the Mishnah where that is talked about. And that's perfectly consistent with the way that Jesus is criticized and depicted by Jews who are opposed to him, such as certain Pharisees in the Gospels. That's exactly what they're saying. They were saying that he was performing miracles through the power of Beelzebub. Then we have Josephus, Josephus is also, we could say, he's a Jew, and yet he was more secular, to use modern terminology, in his writing, in his historical writing, and he's more neutral. But he talks about Jesus doing works, and which uses this Greek word that would translate as something like incredible, paradoxical, or contrary to expectation. So that is definitely fitting of miracles. So everyone's affirming that Jesus performed miracles. They just have different interpretations on where that came from, or different perspectives on it. And that's a lot different than the modern world. Half the modern world thinks that the supernatural doesn't exist and miracles are impossible. Other people do believe in it, but in the ancient times, they all affirmed this. Now, two other sources I will mention. One is very important, actually, because it's so early. Recently, they discovered a cup from the harbor of Alexandria that dates to around 50 AD or so, so second half of the first century. And on it, it had inscribed a dedication, or maybe an incantation. And it says, "Through Christ the magician." So in Egypt, and with all their magic, they viewed Jesus as this magician, like we see with Celsus. And if you go to slightly later magical papyri from Egypt, it talks about Jesus as a magician also, or associates him with magic. And one of the ways they say that you could cast out a demon was by using the name Jesus, God of the Hebrews. So they were familiar with this stuff. And from an Egyptian magic perspective, Jesus was a magician, a great magician.
Now, even more recently, a very interesting cup was discovered in the harbor of Alexandria. It was unearthed in 2006. I think 2008 is when people first started talking about this, but it's not so well known. On this was a Greek inscription, and it says something like, "Through Christ the magician." There's a lot of debate about this magician part, but possibly not really any better explanations at this point. Now, why would they talk about Christ the magician on this cup? Well, Egypt was obsessed with magic in antiquity, and they were always trying to use magical formulas. And they knew about Jesus. People knew about the miracles of Jesus. In fact, Celsus in the 2nd century attributes the miracles of Jesus to Jesus having acquired miraculous powers in Egypt when he was there as a child. We also see this in the magical papyri of Egypt from just a bit later. One passage in particular is very interesting, where it says that, "How do you cast out demons? You invoke Jesus, the name of Jesus, God of the Hebrews." So they're trying to harness his power there. They see him as a magic worker, but they're aware of his title, Christ, here.
Well, because of all this teaching and claiming to be God and performing miracles, the leaders of Judaism, Pharisees and Sadducees, wanted to get rid of Jesus, execute him. And that whole week begins with the triumphal entry on Sunday, Nisan 9 of 33 AD, when he goes from Bethphage to Bethany to Jerusalem. And we know where all those places are located, Bethphage and Bethany. There have been some excavations there. We know they existed in the 1st century. And he passes through this area into the gate there, the eastern gate. So that gate that you see in the photo is, of course, a later build of the gate, but underneath that, there actually have been some finds of an earlier gate that seems to be from the Herodian period, the 1st century, which would have been the gate that Jesus passed through. The Last Supper occurs later in that week. You can go visit a traditional site of the Last Supper there on the left, which probably is in the right location, but it's not the same building. There have been excavations underneath there that have found first century architectural remains. We know from a variety of ancient sources too that there was this Church of the Apostles on Mount Zion that was then constructed there later. So there's a very early tradition that this was the upper room where the church originally met in Jerusalem. Gethsemane also is known, that location. It was an olive orchard in the first century. And inside that Byzantine church, there's a rock which traditionally says that was where Jesus prayed. We don't know that for sure, but it is the right location in terms of Gethsemane and this olive grove. Well, Jesus is then arrested, and we have the trial of Jesus. The trial of Jesus is extremely well corroborated in the archaeological record. We have these characters: Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate, Herod Antipas, and Jesus. We might even also put Peter in there, who are all attested in ancient inscriptions and archaeological structures and artifacts. So we can begin with Annas. Annas is mentioned in the writings of Josephus as a high priest. He was not the acting high priest at the time, but he still retained the title. And on the right there is what's believed to be the tomb of Annas. It doesn't have, we haven't found the name Annas in there, but it is in the exact location where Josephus places the tomb of Annas, and it's the most elaborate tomb of that period that's been discovered in Jerusalem. So it's very fitting for that. We don't know exactly which house Jesus went to appear before Annas, but there are currently 3 good candidates. This one, I think, is probably the best because we know it was actually a high priestly house in the first century. You can see the elaborate mosaic floors. You can see those stone ritual washing pots. But this house yielded an inscription mentioning the Cathros family, who was a high priestly family later on in the first century. So perhaps they used the same mansion for the high priests, kind of like presidential mansions, mansions for prime ministers and so forth. But anyhow, it at least gives us a good idea of what that looked like. Caiaphas was the acting high priest, and he is mentioned by Josephus. In fact, we know his name was Joseph, son of Caiaphas, because of Josephus. But his ossuary was actually discovered in the 1990s, just outside of Jerusalem, or ancient Jerusalem. And it was inscribed in Aramaic with the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And it was an incredibly elaborate ossuary, or bone box. And it was in a family tomb of the Caiaphas family. Also, they found bones of a 60-something-year-old man in there. So it's almost surely was the burial box of Caiaphas. And more recently, another Caiaphas family ossuary was discovered that gives us a little bit more information. It was of his granddaughter, and it tells us that Caiaphas was a priest of Maaziah, so that was a family line from Beit Imri. So really helps to confirm and give us some more information about that. On the left there, these pillars you see, that's basically all that's left of where the Sanhedrin met at the time of the trial of Jesus. these column capitals, they were put back up in place. They found them scattered all over and ruined, but they're trying to give people an idea of some of the ancient structures. Pilate was, of course, the Roman governor, and he is attested widely. So Josephus talks about him, of course, Philo, Tacitus, and he minted his own coins while he was the prefect or governor of Judea. And then, of course, he's talked about in all the Gospels, but he's actually mentioned in Acts and Timothy too. But we have two other artifacts that attest to Pilate. These inscriptions. So the first was discovered in 1961 in the theater of Caesarea. That was the Roman capital of the province. And it was some kind of dedication to Emperor Tiberius. And it names Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So it gives us his name, it gives us his title. But then very recently, this ring was discovered. It was actually excavated in the 1950s, but no one cleaned it and looked at it until recently. But this is a bronze ring, and it has this Greek inscription with the name Pilato on it. So that's the version of Pilate's name that we see in the Greek New Testament. This was found at Herodium, south of Jerusalem, and it was probably used by someone in Pilate's administration, not by Pilate himself, but again, does attest to Pilate there as an official in Judea. So Pilate's very strongly corroborated. Herod Antipas comes in briefly in the trial narrative. He was the ruler of Galilee, the tetrarch. He issued coins with his title and name, Herod Tetrarch. Did a lot of building. This is the theater at Tiberias, which was the new capital that he built in Galilee. He's talked about in Josephus, and he is also mentioned, referred to in Philo, although he doesn't give us his name. Well, the location of the trial, the praetorium, the trial before Pilate, that is, also is something that we can look at today that is known. This area was excavated in the 1970s, and although the official excavation reports still haven't come out, it has been published in a couple of articles and books, and one of my supervisors was an archaeologist on this, so that was kind of how I found out more about it. But the praetorium was the governor's mansion. This is located in the former palace of Herod the Great, which we're told by Josephus and Philo was then used by the Romans for the praetorium. Some interesting features, though, are still left over. The stone pavement that John mentions, there on the left, part of that is still there. The Gabbatha, the raised place in the top right photo, you can see how that is raised up above sort of the street level where the people would have been standing outside and yelling at Jesus to crucify him. And then this Bema area is also right there on the Gabbatha, where Pilate would have pronounced judgment. So pretty incredible that some of these places, really specific things, are still preserved. And then finally we get to Jesus himself. How is he attested? Well, I would say the number one thing we have archaeologically right now is the James ossuary. Of course, this was very controversial for a while, and it was in an antiquities trial, but after 10 years of it, there was no evidence that it was a forgery. In fact, many scholars scrutinizing it came to the conclusion that it was indeed authentic. And it has this inscription that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, the only relationship of names like that we know of from first century Jerusalem is Jesus Christ and James, who became leader of the Jerusalem church, who is talked about in Josephus also. And there was a statistical study done that estimated, based on Jerusalem's population and the percentage of male names at the time, that there would be less than 2 people to identify this with. So it's a very high probability, just based on those things, that it's talking about Jesus. But something that even adds more to that is that this brother of Jesus part is tacked on. And in all the ossuary inscriptions that have ever been discovered, there's only one other one that mentions the name of the brother. And it doesn't mention the father, it doesn't mention the place of origin or the profession. Here, it's an extra. And that tells us this brother must be really important. There's a reason, there's a big reason why they are adding this onto the inscription. And I think that would be because it's talking about Jesus Christ. And so that would be a first century inscription attesting to Jesus. And we have the cup I mentioned that mentions Christ, the magician, from Egypt too, that's recent, that goes along with this, but this one is even more powerful. Then we get to the crucifixion, and the crucifixion's earliest depiction actually comes from Rome on the Palatine Hill, about 100 to 200 AD. It's called the Alexamenos Graffito. Here's a drawing of it and the original, so you can see Romans were actually mocking Jesus in the crucifixion and Christianity, so they gave him a donkey head. This is exactly the way that Paul talks about the crucifixion for the Roman or Hellenistic mind. It was ridiculous to them because they couldn't imagine a God being crucified, which was a type of punishment reserved for the worst non-citizen criminals. We know that crucifixion was being carried out in the way that the Gospels describe in first century or pre-70 AD Jerusalem because of archaeological discoveries. This one's quite famous, Yehohanan. He still had the nail in his heel bone. There's another discovery fairly recently which found the nail still wedged in the wrist bone of a victim. So we know how it was done. And it's consistent with the Gospels. The crucifixion is talked about by Tacitus, Serapion, the execution of Jesus, and by Lucian. So again, here's more of these first and second century sources talking about Jesus and events of his life. He's buried, and the traditional burial place for the tomb of Jesus is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I think there's really strong archaeological and historical evidence for that. We won't go through that in detail, but I do want to show you what it looked like. So on the top, you can see the same type of tomb that Jesus would have been buried in. This is the only first century tomb in the Jerusalem area that's the same type of Jesus that's still preserved today. So you see the rolling stone there and how it's cut into the rock. Then on the bottom, this is actually the burial bench of Jesus in the tomb. Now, that's not the original, that's covered, but when National Geographic did some reconditioning of the tomb, they removed all that, and for the first time in centuries, they could actually see the original limestone burial bench that had been carved out of the rock inside the tomb. Here's a cross section looking from the top at the tomb of Jesus. So it was a single chambered tomb, which is unique in the Jerusalem area. and you see the burial bench there on the right after you enter. So you can go in today. Here's the entrance, or one of the entrances. They actually have two doors now, so you can pass through. But you can still get an idea, at least, of the kind of size of the tomb. It's obviously been highly modified since the time of Jesus, but it was revered from the earliest days of Christianity, and that's why nobody else used the tomb again or expanded it. And then we get to the empty tomb and the resurrection. And in my opinion, the Nazareth inscription is one of the most important archaeological artifacts connected to the resurrection, because this appears to be the Roman reaction to the resurrection. It tells us that they knew about it and that it was spreading fast, and they wanted to make sure it stopped and never happened again. And so they pronounced this new penalty, death, for anyone who, it says, has moved with wicked intent those who have been buried to other places. All right, so they took a body with an intent, something the Romans call wicked, but it also talks about a specific type of tomb. It talks about sepulchre sealing stones. So it's the same type of tomb that Jesus was buried in, and this is not the Roman type of tomb, but this does fit Judean tombs at that time. And it turned up in Nazareth too, which is quite curious. So we don't have time to get into all the details of that, but I recommend looking at the Nazareth inscription. It's quite interesting and seems to have been issued early in the reign of Claudius, when Herod Agrippa was the king of Judea, and he is somebody that was very opposed to Christianity. Of course, if you read Acts, you see that Herod Agrippa is the first one who orders an execution of the first apostle. And we can see that same kind of reaction spread in Matthew 20:11 through 15, that the soldiers were supposed to say, the disciples stole the body. Well, that is the story, the impression that we get also from the Nazareth inscription. And then finally, we see that there are also even 2nd century, 1st century sources outside of the New Testament that talk about or refer to the resurrection of Jesus. The very famous one comes from Josephus' Antiquities. This is from the 10th century Arabic version, which is a little bit different from the version that most scholars say had some Christian modifications. And in this one, Josephus simply says, they reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah. So he takes a neutral tone here, and he just says they reported this. He doesn't say if he believes it or not, but he's aware of it. Then Tacitus, slightly later than this, he talks about the pernicious superstition or the mischievous superstition of the resurrection and how this belief in Christ had spread all over the Roman Empire. And how this belief in Christ had spread all over the Roman Empire. So again, people were aware of this. They talked about Jesus. They recorded things about Jesus. There is substantial historical sourcing outside of the New Testament for the life of Jesus. The birth, the teaching, the miracles, the disciples, the trial and crucifixion, and the resurrection reports. And archaeologically, we can identify almost every place in the Gospels. So many characters that are mentioned there, big, important political characters, but even very small people like Simon of Cyrene seems to be attested by an inscription. So the archaeological evidence is vast. It shows that Jesus's life and the gospel stories are not mythical, but actually excellent historical sources, which have been corroborated through archaeological and historical sources. So I hope that was helpful and informative for you, and I think we are doing a Q&A about this. So I look forward to your questions.